When the Legends Die, Chapter 44. Charlie, the supply man, came on schedule. He was wiry, curly-haired, and in his late 30s. He was talkative, full of gossip and stories, profane, vulgar, and friendly. He stayed almost an hour, cursing the rocks and the difficult trail, talking of women and liquor. He said that Manuel, the herder who shot himself in the foot, had been operated on. Took his leg off, right up to the knee. Poor bastard. He'll have a hell of a time chasing the women now. But the curses, the women talk, even the sympathy for Manuel were conversational, nothing more. At last he asked, "Got any problems I should report to the boss?" Tom shook his head. "See you next week," Charlie said, and he got into the truck and went back the way he had come. Tom put the fresh meat and the butter into the cooler, stowed the groceries, and was glad to be alone. But that night he dreamed about Blue Elk. The old man came to him in his dreams, with his derby hat and his well-oiled braids and his squeaky shoes and his insistent talk. "The old songs have been sung," Blue Elk said. "The old ways are gone." In the dream, Tom was no longer a boy. He was a man, come back after the long years, but Blue Elk talked as though he was still a boy. "You must learn the new ways," Blue Elk said. "You must learn to read the white man's reading and write his writing. You must learn to plow and plant the field as he says." And Tom asked, "Did you learn to plow and plant, Blue Elk? Did you learn to read and write?" "I am an old man," Blue Elk said. "I speak for your own good." Tom said, "I learned, but don't you know who I am, Blue Elk? I am Devil Tom Black, the killer. I killed you, Blue Elk, and I killed Benny Grayback and the others. I would have killed Red Dillon, but he killed himself. Do you know that, Blue Elk?" But the old man in front of him wasn't Blue Elk at all. It was Red Dillon, and Red was laughing at him. "When you feel that way," Red said, "don't try to take it out on me. Take it out on the horses when you got the chance." "I took it out on the horses," Tom cried. And Red laughed at him again and tilted a bottle and drank and wiped the bottle on his sleeve and offered it to Tom. Tom took a swallow and his head reeled, and Red was gone, and there was Blue Elk again. And Tom was a boy, chanting an old song, a song long forgotten, of the earth rhythm and the water rhythm and the rhythm of the days and the seasons. He chanted, and Blue Elk began to sway in the white man's high-backed chair, to sway and chant, humming the words he couldn't remember. His voice rose to a mournful pitch, a howl that swelled and faded and swelled again. Tom wakened, roused by his own voice and the howling, and after a moment he knew he had been dreaming. The light of the late moon shone through the tent in a dull radiance, and one of the dogs was howling just outside. Tom got up, flung back the tent flap, and spoke sharply to the dog. It wagged its tail, cringing at his voice, and came low-bellied to him and licked his hand. He rubbed its ear and spoke to it, and it went back and curled up beside the fireplace. He went back to bed, and after time, to an untroubled sleep. The next morning he went naked to the creek and bathed in the icy water. As he got out and rubbed warmth into his legs and body, he wondered why he had done it. It was sheer punishment to bathe in the creek at dawn. He usually took his bath in late afternoon, when the air was warm. But when he hurried back and got into his clothes, he felt the glow all over his body, and was glad he had done it. He built a fire, cooked his breakfast, and set his camp in order. Then he saddled the horse and rode out to the flock, remembering the dream and the howling dog. He knew why he had that dream. The supply man reminded him of Red, and thinking of Red, he had thought back to Blue Elk. Nothing mysterious about that. He rode out to the flock, and he walked and sat in the sun, and came in for his noon meal, and went back and told himself it was just another day of waiting. Getting paid for waiting and healing himself, to be ready to get back in the arena. Then he smelled the smells of the arena, heard the sounds. He felt the remembered jolts of a bronc as it lunged out of the chute. He sensed the pattern: lunge, 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 half spin, side jump, lunge, lunge, lunge again. He caught himself. He had made that ride on the big roan in the garden plenty of times. No need to go over it again. He stretched his right leg, tensed his thigh, felt the soreness still there. Not much, but some. He got to his feet, walked along the edge of the flock. He still had a slight limp. He was entitled to that. It was as much a part of him as that stiff left shoulder. The gimps, the scars, they were the marks of his trade. He was a bronc rider. Then he laughed at himself. Tom Black, killer Tom, herding sheep. The days passed, and weeks marked only by the arrival of Charlie, the supply man. Jays came to share his breakfast each morning, and Chipmunks sat on his knee and ate crumbs from his hands at the noon meal. Then one afternoon he plucked grass stems and wove a basket half the size of his fist, his fingers remembering a forgotten skill. Having done it, he knew it was a silly, childish, but he hung it in the bush where a field mouse looking for an abandoned bird's nest might find it and line it and fluff it for a winter haven. He grazed the flock in the smaller meadows near by, and coming back one evening to the bed ground, he surprised two does and their four fawns watering at the creek close by the tent. Seeing that the fawns were losing their spots, he realized how swiftly the season was passing. The sun was moving south, the days shortening, and a few mornings later he saw a white cap of snow on Pagosa Peak far off to the northeast. Then Woodward arrived again. Tom was eating his noon meal when Woodward drove up. He got out the other tin plate and cup, poured coffee, and told Woodward to help himself to the stew. Woodward asked the expected questions about the sheep, the supplies, the grass. He kept watching Tom, and finally he said, "Found some rodeo pictures the other day in an old magazine." Tom went on eating, made no comment. "One bronc rider," Woodward said, "was a dead ringer for you. His name was Tom Black. Ever know him?" "Yes." "Quite a rider, I judge." "That's what they say." "Whatever happened to him?" Woodward asked with a smile. "He's still around." Woodward seemed pleased with his discovery and didn't press Tom for more information. He finished his coffee, set his plate aside. "Well, come on, let's have a look at the sheep. I'm going to move them down in another couple of weeks." They got in the pickup and drove out to the flock, went slowly around them. Woodward stopped from time to time to look and appraise. "Let them get all the grass they can before the drive," he said. "I'd like to start them in good shape. I'll bring men up from the home ranch to help move them." They drove back toward the camp, and Woodward said, "I told you when I hired you that I keep good herders on for the winter. Want to stay?" "I've got other plans." Woodward smiled. "Think you're ready to ride again?" "Yes." "Huh. I knew when I hired you that you weren't a sheep herder, but I needed a man, and you seemed to know sheep, and you knew this part of the country, so I took a gamble. I will say, you've done a damn good job at that." Tom got out of the tent. Woodward said, "See you in a couple of weeks," and drove back down the valley.